when you were younger and you get into this game and you think, oh man, there's an aftermarket part that's certainly better than the factory part, right?
Yeah.
And then the longer you do this, the more you realize often the factory part is better than the aftermarket part.
On this episode of Tuned In, we've got Tony Palo joining us from Texas, and Tony is the owner of T1 Race. He's also involved with the Injector Dynamics brand along with his business partner Paul Yor. And Tony is no stranger to drag racing, particularly he has been pretty deeply involved in the import drag racing world for quite some time now. And I remember following some of Tony's escapades, particularly in his original front wheel drive Integra back when I was first getting involved in the tuning industry as well. These days, Tony's shop has grown significantly, as we'll find, and he's also moved from Hondas into the R35 GTR platform. More recently, he's also moved out into the Audi R8 and Lamborghini Huracan markets as well. Particularly with that R35 platform, we're starting to see huge power numbers out of these cars. Well, maybe not just recently. They've been making silly numbers for a fair while, and cars deeply into the 6-second vicinity on the quarter mile, well over 200 plus mile an hour when we're looking at half mile racing as well. And of course, when it comes to a factory 3.8 litre V6, there's a lot that goes into, first of all, making 2,500 plus horsepower, and let alone with some reliability, as well as also managing that and getting it to the racetrack, particularly when you've got a complex, sophisticated 6-speed dual clutch transmission that you also need to deal with. So as we go through the interview with Tony, we'll find out a little bit about what makes his cars tick, what he's found over his time developing that platform, and where he sees the future of the R35 platform. Before we get into that though, I just wanted to talk about a topic which actually came up very briefly in our conversation with Tony today, and this was a Instagram that I put up recently. It's a photo of a very small drive-by-wire throttle body that is on the intercooler charge piping. This one was actually from World Time Attack, and it's on a Mitsubishi Evo Time Attack car. We've also seen these used on drag racing applications, and there's a couple of reasons why this is used. This actually replaces the conventional blow-off valve or bypass valve that's used to vent excess compressed air when the driver lifts off the throttle. But the other aspect with this, particularly we see in engines that are small capacity with large turbochargers, and this is what Tony refers to as we go through the podcast, we can get into a situation where the turbocharger can run into surge, and essentially, for want of a better term, that surge is happening where we push the compressor to a point where it's creating unstable airflow. Liken this to basically putting out more airflow than the engine can consume. And it's very violent. It can actually also damage the turbocharger. So something to stay away from. Now, with drag engines that are really highly tuned and pushing huge boost pressure, generally when we are very high in the RPM, where the efficiency of the engine is high, it will consume all of that air and of course makes lots of power, which is great. What we can find, however, is if, for example, the car gets a little bit loose as it goes down the strip, maybe the driver has to short shift or back off the throttle, what that can result in, particularly with the short shift, the engine will drop lower in the RPM where its volumetric efficiency isn't as great, and this is what can drive that turbocharger into surge. So using some carefully planned strategies in the ECU, it's possible to use the drive-by-wire throttle body not just as an electronic blow-off valve, but also to open if the turbo goes into surge, to relieve that excess airflow, move the turbocharger out of surge until the RPM increases. Now, if you are interested in learning a little bit more about boost control strategies, mainly some more mainstream strategies and how to tune those, we do have a boost control tuning course which would be perfect for you. It gives you a nice simple strategy that you can apply to tuning boost control on factory or aftermarket engine management systems. Importantly, it also covers a step-by-step process you can use for dialing in the PID control algorithm for closed loop boost control. And I know that even a lot of fairly established tuners still struggle with this. This is the way of getting rock solid solid, stable boost regardless of your system. As a listener to this podcast, you can also use the coupon code podcast75, and that will give you $75 off the purchase of your first HPA course. And we'll put a link into the description that you can follow to get you there. All right, with our intro out of the way, let's jump into our interview now. Welcome to the podcast, Tony. And I think for those who've maybe been hiding under a rock and particularly out following R35 GTR drag racing and half-mile racing events, can you maybe give us a quick recap on your history in T1 race and how you've kind of got to the point you're at now?
Sure. Yeah. So I started playing with cars in high school. Honda cars back then were that was fast and exciting. Yeah. And everything's, progressed over the years, but I got a job working at Motec Motorsports when I was a senior in high school. And I didn't know anything in particular about cars, just had a decent mechanical sense. And I had bought a bunch of parts for my car from Motec, and I put them on myself. And he's like, "Wait, you did all this yourself?" I said, "Yeah." So he offered me a job and kind of jumped in there and grew with it. But I've always had a desire to understand how everything works. And while I never had any formal training for any of it, the internet's a pretty good resource, and there's a lot of information out there. So whether I'll talk to that for a second, because we quite often get asked about this in terms of the training we offer. Basically, how does what we do differ from a qualified mechanic? And while obviously there's these trades, there's mechanics, there's auto electricians, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with those. What I find, and I think this is probably where you're getting to as well, is our performance automotive industry is incredibly different. And I've seen a lot of mainstream mechanics that I've employed through my old shop, and I'm sure you're in the same boat, where their experience in what they've learned through their apprenticeship, and they may be qualified and they may be excellent at working in a franchise dealership, but often that doesn't really translate that well to the performance industry. Yeah. A lot of the guys have gone through just some general mechanic training, and it seems like not really taken the time to get a better understanding of the inner workings and understand how. In the end, if you know how it works, you can figure out how to improve upon it. You can optimize things. You can do things like that. But just kind of going through the motions of, well, I was taught this, and not really. I think the biggest place that I see things like that is when people are trying to troubleshoot a problem. And, if you don't understand how things work, the troubleshooting process gets a lot different. If it's a stock car and you've got a manual or some expensive piece of diagnostic equipment that points you exactly down the trail to where you don't even have to think, just follow this step, follow the next step. But race cars, they're a little different.
Yeah, I think that ability to understand the mechanical workings and actually go through some common sense fault finding and a diagnostic path is a skill that sadly is maybe being lost, particularly with these more complex late model cars. The techs these days really are focusing solely on their scan tools. And, sometimes you got to sort of pop the hood and go, hey, you know what? The plug wire is actually just hanging off. That's probably our issue.
Yep.
But we digress a little bit anyway. I'll let you continue with your history.
Yeah, so I ended up getting a job at Motec. I worked there. We were all pretty green at this and learning together. And so started turbocharging Kenny's race car, and that was fun. And we learned slowly. Back then, fuel injection was very basic as far as the aftermarket stuff, at least.
Of course.
And so, dyno tuning a naturally aspirated Honda was a matter of adjusting a fuel pressure regulator and turning the distributor a little bit and adjusting some cam gears. So it's kind of, you kind of couldn't go wrong, but it was repeatable enough to make sense of what you were doing and learn, okay, well, when I'm doing this, I'm doing this. I mean, back then you're adjusting cam gears, but you don't know anything about cam overlap or anything. It's just, I go this way, this happens. So that's better. And back then everything was simple like that. So I kind of got to grow with the industry.
Yeah.
We went from the Excel DFI Gen 6, which was, just stupid basic,
And then at that point, we were running in the NHRA Sport Compact Series, and NHRA started to allow methanol for our class.
Right.
And we didn't know anything about methanol except that real race cars run it, right? So we kind of poked around, and at that point, we reached out to Bob Norwood because he was local, and he's been doing this forever. So he's definitely got a lot of experience, at least.
Yeah, he's definitely got some runs on the board.
Yeah. So we ended up, he helped us get a Motec installed on the car, and it was a Motec M48 back then. It was that long ago. And came to a few races with us to help us get it sorted. And, we learned a lot from that process and continued to grow with things. And I guess it was a couple years into that racing, he offered me a job building chassis at his shop. He had bought a house. He kind of sold the Ferrari part of his business, and he bought a house with a shop in the back. And he said, I just want to build race cars. And the money was good, and it seemed like a neat opportunity because I kind of felt like where I was at that point. I was 7 years in at Jotech, and I didn't really feel like I had a lot of opportunities to learn other than what I was teaching myself.
Sure.
Working there. So I took that opportunity. We built some really neat shit. Some of it worked, some of it didn't.
Actually, if I remember correctly, so I've followed a little bit of the Bob Norwood story over the years. He's sort of one of the sort of OGs back in the scene, and has done some crazy stuff from what I understand. I think you mentioned Ferrari, and I think he was twin turbocharging Ferraris from what I recall, but he also built a Honda funny car with a billet block that was running on nitromethane. Is that correct?
That was a plan for all of it. Sure. It was a full billet, cylinder head, block, everything. If I remember right, it was Batten that built it.
Sure.
But it was a big 4-cylinder with a big turbo on it, and it never really did a whole lot, but it looked really cool. And it was
counts for something.
Funny car chassis with an Integra body on it, and I think they ran it on methanol a little bit, and it kind of did some stuff there, but I don't think it ever really did anything on nitro.
Okay.
But that was a neat car. It was built before I got there, and it basically sat in the garage the whole time that I was there. And then I think he started playing with it a little bit some years after I left.
Right.
So I don't really know where that stands right now. But we built some neat stuff. We did a pro front wheel drive car for Chris Rado that was very different. It was a solid axle in the front with a kind of a backwards 4-link and a V-drive and a Lenco transmission. And
that was with the north-south mounted engine. Basically, everything to get the weight right in front of that axle line. Yes.
Yep. So we started with the development on that. We wanted to run a really, really big tire. And the problem with the tire being so tall and wanting to keep the center of gravity as low as you could is the roof line wasn't too much taller than the tire. And we said, well, no problem. We'll sit the driver in the center of the car and, have the hood come down in between the tires.
Yep.
So we get into building this thing, and then it turns out the SFI rulebook, as far as what the cage spec needs to be, has a spec for left-hand drive where the bars on the left-hand side need to be bigger and or thicker than the bars on the right-hand side.
Sure.
Or a right-hand drive car that's the other way around. But there isn't a spec for the center drive. And we said, well, what if we just build it with the bigger bars on both sides, right? I mean,
makes sense.
It seems like it would be safer in any regard, but they weren't having that. And so we had to make it normal left-hand drive.
Okay.
And when the car was all said and done, it wasn't the safest car to drive because you couldn't see very well.
Yeah. When you're running the sort of target times you're looking for, I think visibility out of the driver's seat is probably pretty key.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's probably helpful. So that car didn't end up doing a whole lot. They ended up building another chassis, and that was the one that Shane worked on, and it ended up, it was, took that same concept and ran with it, but it was very different. It's still very different. If somebody was to build one today, it's not a whole lot unique happening in the front wheel drive,
Sure.
at least in a solid axle regard.
Yeah.
So that was cool. So I was there for a couple of years, built that car, built an all motor Honda that came out really neat. And then a friend of mine was talking to me, and he said, I think it's time. It's time for you to do your own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 2005, I saved a little bit of money, and I was didn't have any kids or anything at that time, so had a little bit of money to invest into something. And I didn't have money to start anything like what we have now, but I had some money to rent a little bay and buy my welder and buy some fabrication stuff, and that's what I did. And I had a guy that I shared the shop with at that point that his business was just selling parts. And I said, look, I don't have any money for inventory and stuff. So if you're going to be selling parts, and if you'll have stuff in stock that I can use on my builds, I'll pay you retail for it just for the convenience of having it there.
Sure.
So that was the goal. But I left my job and jumped in both feet first, and this just had to work for me. I put everything I had into it, where he still had his day job, and he was just doing this on the side.
Right.
And so he was never in as much, and he made it about a year, and he's like, it's not working for me. So in the end, it was, it wasn't a big deal. We weren't partners. We were just sharing a building, but it allowed me to get through that first year with less rent, and it worked well. So I made it about 8 months on my own, handling every aspect of running a business. So phones, paperwork, email, building cars, tuning cars. And then I couldn't keep up anymore. So I hired a friend of mine, and we've just grown slowly from there. So we're in our third building now, and I think we're going to stay here for a while. So this one, we kind of had a fresh slate. When I bought the building, it was just empty warehouse. So we got to start from scratch basically and build it how we wanted it. So it still serves us well.
Could you give us a sort of an idea of how many staff and what size that facility is now, just for those who aren't aware?
Sure. So we have about 16,500 square feet on the ground. Mm-hmm. 15,000 of that is air conditioned. So that was a big plus. I never got really to work in an air conditioned shop when I was working on cars.
Yeah, that makes it nice.
And then we've got about 4,000 square feet of storage upstairs, which is really handy because, the stuff like the bumpers, and we do a lot of wheels and all that stuff that takes up space can be up there out of sight. So that works well. We've got 16 employees right now.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. We did pretty well.
I think just for maybe anyone who's listening is sort of on the fence and maybe contemplating, jumping into starting their own business. It can be a bit of a minefield. We've done it ourselves with two separate businesses, and I think what you said there, which stuck in my mind, is committing to it, because if you've got a lifeline, it's very hard to sort of go all in, and that's what these sort of businesses require, at least in the early years. And then the other thing that you've done, which is quite obvious, is you didn't start with that massive facility. You've grown the business and your staff as your customer base has grown. And I think the other thing I'll point out again, just for the entrepreneurs who maybe are looking at this, is it's one thing being good at the task that you want to base the business around, be it fabrication, mechanical skills, or tuning. But the bit that's really easy to miss, at least in my own experience at the start, when you're just the one-man band, you're probably only spending about maybe a third to half of your time on that. And then it's, as you mentioned, all of the other stuff, the invoicing, dealing with customers, quotes, the bookwork, and that's the bit that's really easy to overlook. So the quicker you can grow and get other people involved in that, so you can focus on the part you enjoy, the better, I think.
Yeah, for sure. There's, as in our industry specifically, you see it all the time, right? There's a lot of people that are good at what they do, and they're terrible at running a business. And so you see these new businesses, and everybody wants to get business in, so they're advertising stuff really cheap to get the work in, and then you can't keep up, and you don't have enough profit margin to sustain everything, and then build times are taking forever. And
I think that's one of the things that unfortunately has given the whole industry worldwide a really checkered reputation, is this incessant over-promising and under-delivering. But we're sort of getting off track. I don't want to be here sort of bagging those out there, giving it a go. But I mean, the skills of being a business owner often are very different to the skills of actually working on a car, and that's kind of important. Well, let's get into sort of your shift from that Honda market into the R35, which I think you probably at the moment T1 is best known for. So when the R35 platform first launched in the US, why did you look at that and go, you know what, this is the one, this is where we're going?
I had zero plans for it.
Okay.
So when all of my experience in the past was Honda stuff. So when I opened my shop, that was naturally what I started doing. And then in 2006, I built an Integra for a customer, and he was taking it to the local tracks and stuff. And he wasn't much of a driver. He didn't understand the car very much. So he wasn't really getting the results that he hoped for. And he asked me to come to one of the events with him and ask if I would drive the car. And I've never driven, at the time, this was like 650 horsepower. I'd never driven anything like it, but I understand the car pretty well. And so I figured, what the hell. And I jumped in the car. We ended up running a 10.0 or a 10.1, which was the fastest front wheel drive street car in Texas at the time.
Right.
And we won that event, and I was hooked and he was hooked. And so that was what started the T1 race car.
Sure.
So we went the next season. I said, look, if I'm going to drive this thing, I want to make it faster. I'll do the labor on it. You cover the parts. So we did, and we went 9s next time out, and it continued to progress, and everything was great. But, after a year of that, as the guy who just pays for it and gets to smile and watch it, I think the fun kind of goes away.
Yeah,
so,
probably.
It ended on good terms, and he asked me if I would buy the car from him, and so I did, and continued racing that up until 2010. So in 2010, business was doing pretty good. I had always liked the way the GTR looked. Mm-hmm. So I was finally at a position where I could buy one. So I bought a used 2009 GTR. I literally said, as I was driving it home from the dealership, this thing's perfect. I'm not going to touch it.
Famous last words.
I honestly thought that was how it was going to go down. Yeah. So I ended up 2 weeks later, the Texas Mile, there's a race coming up, and a friend of mine had a ticket and his car wasn't going to be ready in time. And so he said, hey, if you want to take my ticket and run your GTR, you can. I'm like, all right, well, that's cool, because I was already going.
Sure.
So I figured, well, if I'm going to run it, I might as well at least put exhaust on it and tune it. And so built an exhaust for it, put a cob on it, tuned it, ran it out there, and it, made 600 horsepower or something. It's not like it was, super fun at that point, but I put wheels on it and started doing a couple little things. But then we were going to local race events at Import Face Off, and I've got the Integra out there. We're racing the Integra, and people are coming by seeing the GTR, and they're saying, can you guys work on GTRs too? And obviously, compared to the $10,000 Hondas we're working on, there's a lot more potential with a $100,000 car.
Of course. Yeah.
So, for about a year, we kind of did a little bit with the GTR, and then we're still playing with the Honda stuff. And then I said, we've got more GTR work coming in than we can keep up with. It doesn't make sense to be working on, smaller Honda builds. So definitely. In 2011, we stopped working on everything but the GTR. And I had my car, and, the way I've always been, I don't want to learn on a customer's car. So this is a new platform to us. We want to learn. If we decide we're going to work on these things and we're going to continue pushing it, we need a car to do it with. And so that's what my car has always been. Mm-hmm. And, why it's gone through so many stages, but it's been good. And we've, started out as nobody in the market. There were a lot of people doing it before we were. So it's not, we certainly weren't the first to that market, but I think we've made a pretty good name in that field after 10 years of racing them.
Yeah, I mean, you only have to look at the results from any of the events like TX2K or World Cup finals, and T1's definitely prominent up there. So you've got the runs on the board to prove that you know what you're doing with it. I think probably what I'd like to know is obviously you've just mentioned you're using your own car for the development, and I think that's I can applaud you there for doing the development on your own car rather than a customer's, which is how a lot of shops do it. Obviously from where you started to where you are at the moment with cars in the sixes, what have you sort of seen as the biggest change that's led to these improvements in top speed and ETs over the time you've been working on that platform?
Power's probably number one, I would say, but not far behind it is the engine management side of things.
Yeah.
So, we went from having the stock ECU and only being able to control 6 injectors with limited control of other systems. So eventually that's a power limitation. So then the standalones start coming out, and now we can do stage injection. And now the stock ECUs, they have a way to do it as well. So, we don't have fueling limitations anymore.
Yeah.
But by the time you start to make the kind of power that you need 12 injectors for, or 18 injectors on the bigger stuff, there's a lot of limitations with the stock ECU. So basically any of these cars that are doing anything, remotely big, all have a standalone in them. And that's been everything.
So from what I understand in that market at the moment, you've essentially got two main players, which are Syvecs and the Motec M1 platform, which you favor. Is that about right? Or are there other players out there as well? Yeah.
No, it's really just them.
Okay.
I mean, in any kind of volume.
Yeah, and when those came on board, I'm assuming that when Motec initially released that R35 package, which is essentially plug and play with the ability to then add on additional sensors, outputs, etc., like you said, 12 injectors, that in itself also developed as a product over the years you've been involved with it?
Yeah, certainly. So Syvecs was the first one to come out with the 12 injector option, and so we started putting those on everything, and we did a lot with it, and it was very, very new, a very new product for Syvecs. We learned a lot. We hurt some parts along the way because things weren't right, and it's just that's how it goes, right? That's the learning, and the Motec's been the same way. There's been plenty of things to learn along the way. When they do a development for a piece like this in Australia, they're not racing the car.
Yeah.
Right. They're reverse engineering what stock ECU is doing and putting something in place that will do the same thing. So everything is fundamentally right for the most part, but there's just some limitations. Like the Huracan kit that they built, they never even launched the car, which they don't necessarily need to, but we're doing the further development on things like that, and both manufacturers have been really great about taking what we learn and making corrections and improving it. So both kits have certainly evolved a lot from their release.
I guess it's important to understand for these manufacturers such as Motec and Syvecs. I mean, it's usually not feasible for them to be developing a car to test their product on that's going to run 6-second quarters. So, I mean, they do have to heavily rely on the likes of you guys at that cutting edge to sort of give them the feedback on where that product's lacking, what other features or problems need to be ironed out, correct?
Yeah, certainly. And, we're the ones that need what they can offer us. So it's not like we're not going to be open to giving them feedback so that allows us to do our job. So it works well. It's a two-way street.
Now, there's some other complexities, particularly around the R35 platform. These days, integration with all of the other electronic modules in just about any production cars is a given. So it makes it a little bit more complex than just replacing the factory engine control module with an aftermarket standalone. You could probably get the engine running, but then none of your electronic systems work. Maybe your aircon doesn't work. Your gauge cluster probably won't work. And that's fine. That's the reverse engineering you're talking about with Motec, basically getting all of that CAN communications up and running so everything else works. The tricky integration, and I mean, obviously here, I'm no expert on it, but I've got a broad understanding of that platform. The tricky integration there is between the transmission control module and the engine control module, because that GR6 dual clutch transmission is so pivotal to getting the R35 to do what it does. So can you talk to us a little bit about how the Motec communicates and sort of works in conjunction with the stock TCM?
Sure. So the Motec is trying to emulate what the stock ECU is doing in that regard. A lot of it actually works kind of backwards of what you might think, and that the TCM tells the ECU what it wants, especially in a shifting event or anything like that. So the Motec sends pedal position, throttle position, engine speed, torque, and a number of other things to the TCM to allow it to do what it wants to do. So all the programming is within the TCM.
Yep.
And the only manipulation that we have from the Motec would be kind of lying to it about different inputs. For instance, we may take a clutch that could handle 600 pounds of torque and then put something in it that'll handle 1,800 foot-pounds of torque, and it doesn't shift very well, especially in the mid-range, right? So
Sure.
we can't get into the factory TCM enough to adjust the proper tables for that kind of thing. So our way around that is lying to the TCM about how much torque we're making in those regards. So we tell it we're making less torque. It reduces the clutch pressure in those areas, and you can get the car to drive a lot more like stock.
Is this a bit more challenging for that aspect if you're dealing with a pretty heavily modified car that's going to be street driven, where those part throttle and sort of lower RPM shifts are more critical than for an outright drag car where everything is likely going to be wide open throttle only?
Yeah, it's way more difficult on the, as we get big cams and big injectors and the big clutch, all of those things that make a car drive nice have kind of gone away. And so it's definitely more difficult to get a car to drive nice. We don't do a Motec in something relatively stock very often. We've done a couple where somebody was we'll put the Motec in now because we know where we're going to go later. And you tune a car with a stock engine and a stock clutch on a Motec, and it's like, wow, that was really easy.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you've mentioned the torque value and sort of cheating that, lying to the TCM about what's actually going on, which actually brings me to the next aspect where the Motec does things a little bit differently on this platform, where it is actually a torque-based model as opposed to a conventional speed density based model that we're probably more used to with aftermarket. Nothing particularly new about this. OEs have been doing it for a long time. But can you maybe just give us a little insight on what's the difference here? What is a torque model, and how does that sort of work from a tuner's perspective?
Yeah, so whatever your reason might be for limiting power or torque, whether it's traction or the strength of a part or anything like that, it all boils back down to torque, right?
Yeah.
And so if rather than doing boost control by gear, for example, you're doing torque control by gear, if you were to overlay the dyno graph of the same peak torque number, but one of them doing torque control where it's going to turn the boost up as engine speed increases, you're going to get a significant amount more power on the torque-based one with no additional force at the tire. So if the tire would hold the torque at the peak, then it's going to take it up top too. So you can really optimize acceleration that way. And really, we've got really good traction control and really good launch control, and that's kind of like a fallback, but you don't want to rely on that solely. So the goal is to get all the torque limiting dialed in to where, as far as I'm concerned, I want to be just over what it'll take to where the traction control is just barely working, right? Because the road might get better. Might get worse too, but it might get better. So then it can accelerate better. But that works both ways too. And that when the transmission controller needs a torque reduction for a shift, it knows you're making this much torque and I want this much torque. So it can send a proper torque reduction to the TCM, or to the ECU, which it will listen to, whether it's ignition retard or ignition cut or throttle. But it has all those ways of reducing torque. So
with a conventional dual clutch transmission, factory engine management system, obviously smooth drivability and nice smooth shifts are obviously what they're looking for. And I mean, there's various ways of doing that. One of the nicest ways of reducing torque in that way was probably going to be either ignition retard, or ignition retard maybe coupled with closing the throttle, which with a big turbo we don't really want to do. Closing the throttle in particular is going to mean that it's going to take time to spool back up when we get back to wide open throttle. So what are your options there? You've mentioned, or what are you using, I should say, on the drag cars? Do you keep the throttle open the whole time, or is that not reduce the torque enough for the transmission to live?
Yeah, definitely keep the throttle open.
Yep.
Especially as the turbos get big. Otherwise, it's terrible.
Yeah.
So my preference is ignition retard as long as that's enough. Mm-hmm. So on some of the big cars where we're running all the clutch discs that can fit and we're running all the clutch pressure that we can, and it's still not necessarily enough, then I'll induce a little bit of ignition cut on the shift. No more than I need to, because it will kill the boost. Not as bad as the throttle, but it'll still kill the boost.
Yeah.
So ignition retard, and then only cut if I need it.
So essentially, if you've got enough clutch and they're not going to slip, you could basically perform the shift with little to no torque reduction.
You could, as long as all the parts will take it. So
yeah.
The newer GTRs in stock form, when you launch them, there's no torque reduction on the shift.
Okay.
So they figured, we know that all the parts will take it, and when you're launching it, we assume that you're at a racetrack where you need every last little bit. Yeah. And so they've determined that in that situation, they'll take the torque reduction away just to get that last little bit. So you kind of don't ever want more than you need, but you need it at some point.
Sure. All right, so the complexity here is we've talked about the Motec side of things, but this is still communicating with the stock TCM, and you're still going to need to make some changes to the calibration of that TCM. So now you're using 2 software packages for tuning the entire car, is that correct?
Yep.
And what's the software of choice for that?
Ecutech and Cobb both have an option for the TCM, and depending on how much stuff you need to tweak in there, if you just need to raise clutch pressures and kind of raise the launch limiter and some temperature warning thresholds and such, they can both do that. Ecutech has a little bit more control in there, but there's a lot of undefined tables that most people don't have the balls to go in there and start tweaking to see what happens. So we're still, in our biggest cars, we're definitely at a point where we could benefit from more control.
Sure.
On that note, Motec started developing an M1 TCM in 2010 or 11 or something, working with Dodson.
Yeah.
And that was back when the factory TCM ROM was kind of crude. Compared to today, there was a lot of room for improvement.
Okay.
And then as they were working on the development of this, the stock stuff kept getting better. And at the time, we weren't making enough power to require a standalone TCM.
Yeah.
So the project kind of got shelved. And a couple of years ago, I pushed pretty hard to get it taken off the shelf and finish the development on it, because every car in my shop could benefit from it at this point.
Yeah.
So it was written with an older version of M1 build, and so it had to be updated to the latest version. So they did that, and I put it in one of the cars here that is a street car that I could just go drive and really get a feel for it and learn it. So it does exist. There's one, but it does exist, and it still needs some more work. It's not ready, and since nobody can go to work in Australia for the past year and a half, it's kind of taken a back seat, and it'll be really neat when it's done, because it'll open up, the possibility to have proper data logging and related to everything in the transmission computer.
Yeah.
We can run more clutch pressure, which is a problem.
The hard-coded limits or something on clutch pressures at the moment that you can't change.
And not saying there's not a way around it, but I'm unaware of anything. 22 bar is about all I've gotten out of anything.
Okay.
So I ran 25 bar on with the M1 TCM on the street car that I was playing with, just to get a feel for it.
Sure.
The other thing that could be really good there is the GTRs have a real problem drag racing anything but a GTR, right?
Okay.
So if we're on a Pro Tree, if you're on a Pro Tree, you kind of just go in first and get in launch, and everybody knows that they can burn you down, and so you end up sitting there just cringing, because 7 seconds is an eternity in that situation.
Yeah.
We could potentially wire in a clutch pedal and have clutch by wire, and you'd be able to launch the thing like a regular manual transmission car. So you could stage it normally, you have a stage and brake, clutch pedal, and have computer control of the clutch slip on the launch. And obviously you wouldn't use clutch after that.
Yeah.
But that would be a really neat thing to add to one of these cars for somebody who wanted to drag race.
So let's just go back a bit. So the the inability to drag race anything but a GTR. So is that down to the time required to build boost while you're staging?
Yeah, it takes, on the bigger turbo cars, I mean, it takes a solid couple seconds to get up on launch, right? And without the ability to easily pre-stage, get in launch, and then bump into the fully stage beam, technically we do have the ability to do it, but it's kind of a pat your head, rub your belly thing, and try to cut a light at the same time with what you have to do with the button. So the ability's there, but I couldn't possibly do it myself and cut a light.
Yeah, I mean, having the ability to do something is one thing, but having the ability to do it repeatedly under the stress of trying to also cut a light and beat a competitor off the tree and do that time and time again is something completely different. In terms of that strategy, just so for those who maybe aren't following, so we see a lot of auto trans cars will come into that first light where they're not fully staged, and obviously, as you mentioned, the bigger turbos, they take a lot of time to spool up, and that can kill everything. So you can sort of get that turbo spooled and then bump the car fully into stage. So basically, when you're into stage, you're ready to go. So whereas you're talking about getting fully into stage, both beams, and then you start building boost, which takes a couple of seconds.
Yep. Yeah, if you go in second on a Pro Tree, you're screwed. I mean, you can't possibly.
Okay. All right, so in terms of the transmission, we've talked about the electronics, but obviously the actual transmission itself is another whole can of worms. And I know, at least here in New Zealand, in the early days, they sort of was something that a lot of people shied away from. There were some problems with some of those very first generation GR6s as well with reliability, and all I heard about was huge bills for repairing them when they went wrong. These days, obviously a lot of those bugs have been ironed out even in the factory cars, and then you look at what's required to put sort of 3,000 horsepower potentially through one of these. Obviously just about every component has to be changed, and I know locally in New Zealand, Dodson Motorsport are pretty much the market leaders for the improved clutches for them and other parts. And you've got John from Shep Racing. He seems to be probably the key person for putting them together. You talk about what actually needs to be done inside a GR6 at these sort of levels.
Yeah, so huge credit to those two people, because as far as I'm concerned, they are the reason that we're able to do this. And to be able to take this engine that was designed for 500 foot-pounds of torque and take 2,000 is really impressive in itself. But it does take a lot of parts. So part of the problem when the GTR was released, it kind of got a bad rap that they always have transmission failures, right? Well, normally your transmission is a set of gears, maybe a differential if it's a front-wheel drive car. But we have that. We have a valve body. We have a clutch. We have a front-wheel drive clutch. We've got drop gears. We've got a ring and pinion. So there's a lot of pieces that fall into this transmission blanket.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of them that need to be upgraded. So starting at the front case, which is where the drive shaft comes in to drive the clutch, the case itself can crack.
Okay.
And so there's a billet case to take care of that part. And then you've got the clutches where we're up to 13 to 14 clutch discs per input shaft.
Yeah.
Upgraded input shaft, every gear in the transmission, the drop gears, the pressure sensors, the front-wheel drive clutch, the shaft driving the clutch, the ring and pinion, the differential cover. There's definitely more aftermarket parts than there are stock parts.
So how close are we to sort of binning the whole thing and looking at something completely aftermarket? Obviously, the dual clutch side of things becomes an issue there. But, I mean, if we look at the likes of some of the, let's say, Lamborghini Huracan, when they develop those for the likes of GT3 racing, they go from the DCT transmission to a proper paddle-shifted dog engagement gearbox. Is that a thing, or do you actually still get an advantage from the dual clutch in terms of that they can go with almost uninterrupted torque, whereas even a dog engagement transmission, we still need that torque interrupt to allow the dogs to disengage?
Right. I think the more important factor of it is, if we're drag racing, which one can we leave the line with better?
Sure.
Right. The DCT in itself going through the gears is great down the track. The gear ratios are not ideal. They could certainly be better for the GTR in anything that we're revving as high as we are. You know, you hear a Huracan go down the track, and I mean, it's through 7 gears before it's even at the end of the track.
Yeah.
And I think tighter gear ratios could be beneficial. We could definitely use a different first gear ratio. But the biggest advantage, I think, is going to be if you go to, say, an automatic transmission with a torque converter, is how the car leaves the line. And that's our big problem. So since we have a little bit of control over how much it slips the clutch on the line, we don't have enough control to rely solely on that, to where, like, if we wanted to run a drag radial tire where you can't spin the tire, you have to leave the line, whether it's clutch slip or converter slip. We can't do it consistently enough to get the type of results that people are getting, you know, on the drag radial tire.
I guess even with, you know, you mentioned 12, 14 clutch discs, we're still talking about a very small diameter basket with all of those clutch discs compared to a conventional drag racing slider style clutch. So I'm assuming that if you slip it like you would slip a conventional drag racing clutch off the line to keep that tire hooked up, you're going to smoke that clutch pretty quickly.
Yeah, so the by the time you get that many frictions in there, the steel plates get really, really thin. So we're about 1 millimeter thick on the steels.
Yeah.
Right. Well, once the steels get hot enough to warp, there went your air gap, and the car it won't shift. Right. So it's certainly a limiting factor. If even we did have the control to slip it as much as we needed, it may or may not take it without breaking. So we've definitely, in manipulating what we tell the transmission computer, we've certainly improved things over the past couple of years. Where our faster cars are in the high 1-teens for 60 foot, which was not happening a few years ago.
It's no joke.
I think that's been one of the biggest things. But also as the engines, as the turbos get bigger, the engines get a little bit bigger, but everything shifts to the right as far as power band goes, right? So we need to keep this thing above, say, 6,000 RPM for a 3.8 or 4.1 liter engine with 80 millimeter turbos. And so if you're going to do that, you either have to slip the clutch pretty far down the track through first gear, or you have to spin the tire quite a bit.
Yeah.
So as we make more and more power, the launch gets harder and harder. For instance, we have a car that makes just over 1,500 horsepower on 58 millimeter turbos. They're extremely responsive. That car can leave the line at 4,000 RPM, and I've gone 1/16 60 foot with it.
Wow.
No big deal. And it just leaves nice and smooth, and it doesn't do anything stupid because there's not so much differential in engine speed on the launch.
Yeah.
It can't bog. It just comes out really nice. So that's been the battle as the cars make more and more power. Is, you know, the power always works out the back end, but
but you've got to get that 60 foot as well, because otherwise you're just making your life a lot harder to get the ET in the deep end.
Yep.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the engine, the VR38. And I mean, it's again a pretty well-known entity at this point. And we've seen over the years, as with most of the drag racing applications, the shift to the billet block. Could you talk to us a little bit about where the limitations were with the stock block, and at what point you sort of feel that the shift to a billet is required?
Yep. So coming from Honda stuff, we had to sleeve everything.
Yep.
And that was just how I'd always done everything. And so the first GTR engine we had apart, we're looking at it, and it's all aluminum. Like, there's not even a steel liner. And we thought, you know, there's no way that this is going to last. Plus, we can put an MID sleeve in there, and we can increase the bore size, which from all of my other engine experience is almost always beneficial.
Yep. So
we did that, and we started making about 1,000 foot-pounds of torque and breaking these sleeved blocks, and the block would crack just at the base of the head stud.
Okay.
And turns out that because so much material had been removed for the MID sleeve to go in, that we'd lost all the strength holding the crank to the block.
So you've kind of fixed one problem and inadvertently created a whole new issue.
Yep. And so it ended up that it was there's kind of a parting line in the casting just below the head stud, and it would just separate right there from cylinder pressure. So we took a step back, and I said, I've never heard of anybody actually breaking one of these sleeves or having a problem with the factory liner. Mm-hmm. It's a plasma sprayed bore. It just looks like it's all aluminum when you look at it. So took a step back, stopped sleeving things, and just said, we'll see how far this goes. So far, we've made over 2,500 wheel horsepower on the factory liners, and I've still to this day yet to have a failure.
That's impressive. So that's one of those areas where you just look at something and from experience, you say this could never work. We're just going to have to fix this from the get-go. And it's stronger than you gave it credit for.
When you were younger and you get into this game and you think, oh man, there's an aftermarket part that's certainly better than the factory part, right?
Yeah.
And then the longer you do this, the more you realize often the factory part is better than the aftermarket part.
Yeah, I think it's easy to overlook that Nissan's budget for research and development is significantly higher than probably any aftermarket parts manufacturer out there. So the old story, if it isn't broken, don't fix it.
Yep. I've learned to take that approach a lot more.
All right. So you've just mentioned 2,500 horsepower on the stock block. So is that the point where the billet is essential, or are there other reasons to switch to billet below that power level?
Really, when it comes as far as our engine program goes, so we have found other problems with the block. Keeping the head gaskets sealed is a big one. Main bearing wear is a big one. And we have addressed all those areas. So our cast block is taking that kind of power, but strength-wise, cylinders and whatnot are capable.
Yeah.
But as far as our engine program goes, if you are making 2,500 or more horsepower, you've got really big turbos. Yeah. And that's a point where the additional displacement from being able to increase the bore size comes into play. So we go to the billet block because we can go from a 4.1 liter to 4.3, which isn't drastic, but it's something at this level.
Yeah, anything's going to help with those bigger turbos.
Yeah, so that's my biggest thing. I haven't found a strength limitation of either one at this point, but we go to the billet block at those power levels for mainly because the car will launch better because we don't have to launch it as high.
So in terms of the limiting factors with the VR38, if we forget about displacement for a moment, you just mentioned head gasket sealing, which I'll get into in a moment, but you just talked about main bearing reliability. And another issue with the V6 design is the limited size of the big end bearing. So is that a real issue? And you sort of alluded to you've got workarounds for those. I don't necessarily need you to tell us all your secrets here, but can you fix those issues basically?
Yeah, so it's tough because there's only 4 main bearings, right? So number 2 and 3 are taking a beating, and the main bearing wear was a big problem. A lot of it was from the block flexing. So we've increased the strength of the girdle and the fasteners, and that's done a lot to keep odd main bearing wear out of the picture.
Sure.
And then the other thing is the factory oiling system above 7,000 RPM isn't amazing. And then you put it in a high G situation and it's even less amazing. So when you look at the oil pressure data trace on a stock oiling system at say 8,000 RPM, it gets real jittery, and that's air. Sure. And so that's the problem. And so what it comes down to is it's not that a higher horsepower level makes that problem worse. It's that the main bearings are all the bearings are taking more of a load, and they're less. They can put up with it for less time. So something that's making 1,000 horsepower will have a longer life there. So anything that we build, if it's going to make over 1,500 or 1,600 horsepower, it gets a dry sump oil system. And that's gone a long way.
Okay. In terms of, before we get into this head gasket situation, in terms of the reliability of the engines in general, I think it's really easy, particularly for those who watch a few YouTube videos and maybe read a few threads on forums or builds in car magazines, to think, well, I can have my 2,500 horsepower GTR and maybe just send it into the dealership every 10,000 miles for an oil change, and that's going to do 100,000 miles with no issues. Maybe a change of plugs once in a while. The reality, however, may be a little different.
Slightly. I wish I could offer that, but unfortunately we can't. We're still working with the size constraints of what Nissan deemed sufficient, right? So
of course,
if you were to take a big billet V8 that makes 2,500 horsepower apart and look at the size of the rods and the size of the crank and everything, it's wild that we're able to do it with what we have.
Yeah.
But we just can't do it forever that way. So on something that makes 2,500 plus horsepower, realistically, I would say 20 to 30 passes would be doing pretty good. Not that it wouldn't need attention at that point. Like I bet if you took it apart at 20 passes, you'd put new bearings in it and maybe put new pistons in it, but it probably won't come apart yet.
Yeah.
And, before we had the head gasket deal sorted, we were just putting MLS head gaskets on it, and I was probably making 1,600 or 1,800 horsepower at the time. And I would run it until I started seeing coolant pressure get high, knowing the head gasket was leaking. And so I would pull the cylinder heads off, put new head gaskets on, but not take anything in the short block apart, because you know what you find is you're going to see where the crank's going to be cracked, the pistons are going to be cracked. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to keep going and see where it comes apart. I put 3 sets of head gaskets on that thing and raced a season and a half on it. And then finally the crank broke.
Wow.
So, where parts aren't perfect and where parts fail is often pretty far apart.
I think you've touched on something that I distinctly remember from Mitsubishi Evo 9 that we were running, that at the time set the world record, and it went as quick as 8:34 at 169. So nothing compared to today's times. But one of the things we noticed with that car was the crown wheel and pinion for the center differential. And we just happened to pull that apart after a full meeting, and it had done maybe 10 or 12 passes, and it had cracks, visible cracks. You didn't need to have it crack tested. Visible cracks through the root of every single tooth on the crown wheel. And we're like, well, okay, obviously we're going to have to change that. That's a no-brainer. And there's no aftermarket parts at that point. I don't even know if there are now. So new crown wheel and pinion went into it. And next time we go to a drag meeting, do the same thing. Lo and behold, it's cracked. So that became a maintenance part for that particular car. After every meeting, we changed it. And I remember we went to one meeting that got rained out, and the car did one launch, didn't even go down the track. And as a matter of course, we were looking at some other things, and the crown wheel and pinion came out, and the damn thing's cracked after one launch. So then it gets to what you were saying. So, well, is it going to fall apart after 12 passes, or is it crack and then it will do 50 passes? But once you've seen a crack there, it's pretty hard to go and put that part back in a car and have a good conscience about it.
Yep. I had an experience with my Honda at one point. Liberty was making a gear set, and we just had it apart for something else. I don't remember what we were doing, but happened to look down, and the pinion gear was like, it didn't even look like it was the same tooth. I mean, it wasn't cracked, but it was so soft that it was sharp and like reshaped. And I was like, oh wow. So yeah, there's certainly a balance somewhere in hardness.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so head gaskets, which is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, because just about any of the sport compact engines that we're involved with in a drag sense, that was basically the limiting factor for how much boost and hence how much power we could actually feed into those engines. So you mentioned MLS, multi-layer steel, which is pretty typical. OEs use those. They're available in the aftermarket. They'll get you so far. what sort of happens to those gaskets that becomes problematic, and what are the solutions in your eyes?
So we had a pretty good MLS program going between, we had a custom gasket built by Cometic for us, and then we had copper O-rings in the block. And what would happen is the cylinder head deck surface would yield. Mm-hmm. And so once that happens, you've lost your clamp on the gasket, and the middle layer, which was the thinnest one, would just start to compress toward the water jacket. So once you took it apart, if you caught it before it blew, you'd take it apart and look at the two outer layers and they looked fine, and then you spread them apart and look at the inner one and it's all wrinkled outward.
Yeah.
So that lasted a long time, but the fact of the matter is the deck surface of the cylinder head will not stay flat at big power for a long time.
Okay.
And so that was the deal. That was why we kept going through this stuff. The current setup we use now, which we've been using for a long time, and I was different about talking about it back then because it was something we had that a lot of people didn't. But we use what we call a fire ring setup now, and it uses you machine a groove into the cylinder, and there's a ring that sits at the top of the sleeve.
Yep.
And it's just a flat surface that contacts the flat surface of the cylinder head, and then the copper gasket goes around that. And so your crush on the fire ring is the distance, the difference between the gasket thickness and this ledge of the ring.
Yep.
And so we've played with a lot of different things there as far as the amount of crush, and then different sealants on the head gaskets and different processes to really dial that in. But the nice thing about that is we still run into, over time, they're going to start leaking because that cylinder head's going to yield. And the difference with that is it's not going to blow it out like it does in MLS.
Sure.
So where some of our race cars, as long as we always set up the cooling system to be able to handle a lot of pressure, and for there to be a safe place for water to go should any get pushed out.
As in not onto the tires.
Right. So with these cars, we always monitor coolant pressure at the outlet of the cylinder heads, which is on the high pressure side of the system.
Yep.
And typically, it always increases with engine speed because it's a mechanical pump.
Yep.
And we typically see on a fresh engine that's not messed up yet, 30, 35, maybe close to 40 PSI by redline.
Okay.
And, what I'm looking for in the data there is that the curve is relatively linear with engine speed.
Yep.
And also, I'll do a scatter plot in I2 where I've got coolant pressure versus engine speed, with the color being manifold pressure.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't want to see it going up as manifold pressure increases.
Yeah.
So eventually it'll start to happen. And I've run cars down the track at over 100 pounds of coolant pressure with no issues. They'll spit a little bit of water out, but I haven't had any problems.
But it's a sign that engine needs a bit of attention in the head department.
Yeah. So, used to when they might see like 50 or 60, we go, all right, this engine needs to come out. And when you're at the racetrack, sometimes you do different things than you would do if you were preparing for a race. Yeah. Like, it's at 60, but I think it's okay. And you keep running it and you end up at 100 and it's still going. And so your window of where it needs to come out kind of shifts a little bit.
Yeah.
So, I'll run them up there as long as the car has been built around it, right? So I don't want rubber lines with, the spring type hose clamps or anything like that where those can blow off. But if it's all AN lines and it's a good radiator and there is somewhere for the fluid to go, then it seems to be okay.
Okay. When you say that the head surface yields, does that mean that the head is a throwaway, or is it able to be decked and recovered a number of times? Because I'm guessing every time you're doing that, you're taking a few thou off the head surface, so that gets thinner and thinner as well, making the problem happen sooner. Is that a fair assumption?
I wouldn't say that I've seen it happen faster after it's been milled a couple times.
Okay.
But we've certainly, you can definitely fix them multiple times before they're trash.
Okay.
So there's enough material there.
Yeah. In terms, it sounds from what you've said that the problem is really the head, not the block. But in terms of other factory cast blocks, one of the issues we see is actually the deck surface of the block itself is not thick enough to be stable. Is that not an issue with the VR38? Or are we already talking about billet blocks at this point, so it doesn't matter?
No, I mean, we certainly run the stock block to power levels where this is a concern. But the deck seems to hold a flat surface a lot longer than the cylinder head does.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think, if you've seen one of the VR38 block, it doesn't have a floating sleeve in a sense. Like there's holes for coolant, but it's very well tied into the perimeter of the block, and it's got a nice beefy surface there.
So a proper closed deck block.
Yeah.
All right, just in terms of that combination with the sealing ring, fire ring as you've called it, and the copper gasket, those copper gaskets, that technology, again, nothing new, and those are used up to top fuel with a O-ring and a receiver groove. So one of the problems is that the copper gasket, however, does a horrible job of sealing oil and water. In your opinion, first of all, have you got techniques to get around that are bulletproof? And in your opinion, is that solution, the fire ring and the copper gasket, suitable for a street application, or is it pure MLS for that?
Definitely suitable for street.
Okay.
And at this point, we do have something that works well and is repeatable for sealing. But that did take a lot of different testing with different chemicals and different processes. Every engine that we do, when it's done, it sits overnight, and we pressurize the cooling system, put a bore scope in the bores, and make sure that nothing's leaking in the cylinders, because we've had issues with that in the past before things were as sorted as they are now. So yeah, it's been a process, but we do have it to where we do it on basically every engine we build.
Okay, cool. All right, look, I think we'll move towards wrapping this up, Tony, before we go too long. Before we do finish up, is there anything that you sort of think that we've overlooked so far in this convo around the R35 that you think we should have talked about?
No, I don't think so. But we didn't talk about turbos, but turbo technology has certainly been a factor in what's allowed things to continue to go faster.
Yeah, 100% agree. Yeah, particularly over the last decade or so. Yeah, the advances in what we've seen with the turbo compressor efficiency, as well as the materials that they're using, the ability to run a bigger turbocharger without sacrificing the response that we used to have to do, has been pretty impressive.
Yeah, on our big stuff, compressor surge was a huge issue just 3 or 4 years ago, and it still is on certain turbos. But we've got kind of the equivalent of about a 2-liter engine with an 76 to 84 millimeter turbo. So it's a big combo, and they end up getting kind of pissed off in the mid range. So there are some turbos out now that don't. And when I was racing my car, every gear change, it would surge until about 7,500 RPM. And you look at the data and you go, I can't believe this thing's running as fast as it is, because it looks terrible in the data. Yeah. So that's come around now. We've got turbos that'll make 3,000 horsepower. They don't fall out of boost. They don't surge anything. So
sure,
it's pretty good stuff.
Yeah. Okay. I guess the other thing, without going too deep down that rabbit hole as well, is the shift from the stock location turbocharger, which really obviously limits what size you can fit in there, to now obviously all of the big players with the R35 are all running the front mount for the faster cars.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, what do you sort of see, if you looked into your crystal ball, what can we expect with that R35 platform? Do you see it just continuing to go faster, or is there going to be some sort of, are we getting into that area of diminishing returns?
We're past that area.
Okay.
but we have one of the best engines out there as far as sport compact stuff goes. And what you're going to start seeing more of is this engine in a more proper, lighter race car chassis with a transmission better suited to what we're doing.
Which is exactly what you've built for yourself.
Yep.
Has it hit the track yet?
No, it's not. So it was at the chassis shop for about a year. And then when it came back, we were all busy, and we sent another car over for more or less the same build. So it's full tube chassis car. Mine is still independent rear suspension, and the drive line's a little bit different. So mine's got a torque converter and a quick drive and a 7-speed Liberty gearbox. And then this other one that we sent over there is a 4-link with a big tire and a TH400.
Okay.
So when that car came back, we started working on it because he's a paying customer and I'm not. So that car just got wrapped up before the Hail Mary Derby this past summer. So we went out there with a car completely new to me and everybody on my team. I've never raced a rear-wheel drive car. I've never worked with an automatic transmission.
Yeah.
So we went out there with a couple thousand horsepower and let's see how this goes. And the driver of the car also has no experience in anything like this. So it was a bunch of new stuff, but it worked out well. On the third pass, the car went 695.
Wow.
And it ran 3 680s after that. And we got the gear ratio a little bit wrong. So the car went in 60 foot super well. It was going 122 60 foot, which for a GTR is pretty good, but for that car, it's not
for a rear-wheel drive drag chassis.
Yeah. So we just made some changes, and we'll be back out with that at World Cup finals in Maryland in November.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. If it's already doing 680s, then that could be pretty exciting once you get it dialed in. So we'll look forward to seeing how that comes out. Now, if we could look back in time, and given your wealth of experience at this point, everything you've learned along the way, is there any advice you would give to a younger version of yourself looking to progress, along a similar path?
I think, like we touched on earlier, the biggest thing that I think was a big part of my success, and I've seen it in a lot of other places too, is that, don't take on more than you can handle and start small and grow as you're able to support that growth. So there's, somebody young that's getting into it that doesn't have a lot of money to start, kind of doesn't have a choice, but, don't finance a bunch of equipment that you don't need. And, I don't think I've ever financed anything that we have here at the shop. I've bought it when I've been able to buy it. Yeah. And that seems to have worked well, but it's going to be hard, and you're going to have to, I think, for me, if I still had a job and I was kind of trying to do this on the side, it wouldn't have amounted to anything. It would have always been a side gig.
I think that really comes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's not something that you can half-ass. If you want to be successful in this industry, it requires commitment, and it requires a huge drive, particularly for maybe the first 5+ years while you're getting established. And the other thing, which sort of comes back to what you mentioned as well, I think people maybe don't understand how important reputation is in the industry, and that issue that so many shops get into of over-promising and under-delivering is a really quick way to destroy that reputation, and that's really all you've got going for you when you're trying to attract more customers.
Yeah, for sure. And I was listening to your interview with Shane, and something came up there, and it needs to be said again. Know when to say no.
Absolutely.
That's something that I've, only learned more and more over the years. And, man, I've been a part of plenty of things that I wish I hadn't. Yeah. And, as you do it more and more, you can pick those things out quicker, but, you don't have to take every job, and don't sell yourself short.
I think there's a lot to be gained from the jobs that you turn away, and that can be a bitter pill to swallow at the time, particularly when you're trying to put food on the table and pay rent. But some of those problematic jobs, the heartache that you'll save yourself is just going to pay dividends time and time again. But can be hard in the moment to know when to say no.
Yep.
All right, last question for today, Tony. If people want to follow you or see what you're up to, where are you on social media? How can they check you out?
We are on Instagram and we are on Facebook. Instagram is T1 Race. Facebook's T1 Race Development. And we are not on TikTok or Snapchat or any of that cheesy stuff.
Fair enough. Just the legit channels. I get it.
Yeah.
All right, Tony, look, really appreciate your time today. It's been a really interesting insight into that R35 platform, and we look forward to seeing particular how your rear-wheel drive chassis goes at World Cup finals.
Yep. Yeah, it's been good talking to you. Hopefully I'll see you again someday.
If this COVID thing ever blows over, we look forward to getting back to the US. All right. Thanks a lot, Tony.
All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.